Okay, so, well, you can see where I hang my broom in the background in my apron. Anyways, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess. I am the founder of a brand called Stark Skincare. You probably know that because you're on a channel called Stark Skincare, so, you know. So today I'm going to talk about just a little topic that's been on my mind. So last night I watched, let me just put down my water bottle. Last night I watched a stand-up. I really like comedy. I really like stand-up on Netflix, and turned out to not be very funny. But that's okay because that actually wasn't the point of it. So I watched Nanette by Hannah Gadsby. And Hannah Gadsby is a stand-up comedian from Tasmania, which is very unique and cool. And she is very unique and cool because she is a lesbian woman who, you know, doesn't identify as being femme. And in Tasmania, especially with the area that she's from, is the Bible Belt essentially of the area. And as she was growing up, 70% of all the people around her thought that homosexuality was a sin and, you know, is punishable, and it just made for her having a really hard time accepting herself. And so I don't want to give away like the whole show because I think it's really worth watching. She touches on so many important subjects, and she's just doing it from her own perspective. And that's really what it's about, is that it's about her telling her story and telling her truth. And, you know, as a comedian, she is a storyteller, but she decided with this show that she was going to tell her story in a completely different way. And that, you know, it wasn't necessarily going to be funny. It wasn't just going to be her normal style, which is self-deprecating humor. She decided to not do that anymore. And so the result isn't really a stand-up show. The result is kind of more of a TED Talk, but it's really powerful, and she gets into all kinds of stuff. Of course, she talks about, you know, gay and lesbian rights and issues. She talks about the transgender community a little bit. She talks about the Me Too movement. She talks about rape culture. She talks about, you know, being a victim. She talks about white straight males and their privilege and power and how they should be using that. She talks about feminism. She gets into mental health, and she talks about art history as context for a lot of this stuff, which I loved because I was a big art history buff back in college. That was probably my best subject. But the little bit that I want to take inspiration from her show last night was how she was talking about how the way that she always structured her jokes was that, like I said, it was self-deprecating humor. And jokes are stories, but jokes are, as she sort of explained it, and I thought this was very interesting because I am someone who's interested in comedy and humor, but she was talking about how a joke is essentially a story, except for it's a story with no real conclusion. There's no real wrap up, and usually like a punchline just sort of leaves sort of an open loop. So when she was talking about her coming out story, she would repeat a certain variation of that tale, right? So she would repeat over and over her coming out story, and in the end, I don't even really remember exactly, you know, it was about not being accepted essentially by her family and her community, but, you know, through like a funny lens. And, you know, she said that because that was so oft repeated by herself, that becomes the focus. You know, the stories that she repeated and that we repeat to ourselves really become the focus of our lives. And what she found that happened, because she was doing it from, you know, from self-deprecation, is that she became stunted in that one space. That it became sort of an arrested development, where she was caught in that awkward coming out story. I don't really remember all of the details of how she feels that affected her, other than she was caught in trauma because her story was about the tension and about how difficult it was and how awkward and how uncomfortable it was. And this is the loop that played in her mind over and over and over. And okay, I could say that probably 99.9% of us are not stand-up comedians. We don't necessarily, you know, repeat jokes about ourselves where we're the butt of the joke, and, you know, self-deprecation might not be a big part of like our, you know, our job description. However, I think that most of us do have stories about ourselves that we repeat over and over and over and over. You know, whether that's you're the chubby girl, or you have acne, or you're messy, or you're disorganized, or you're not a good learner, or you're a bad driver, or whatever it is. We repeat stories from ourselves, and they can come from so many different places, so much of our past, such different sources of these stories. But whatever it is, whenever that strikes a chord with us and that causes some form of trauma in one way or another, and I mean, trauma can be all the way from something really horrific and dramatic to something really not so horrific and dramatic, but that shapes us in some way because it hurt, you know? So, you know, I was told as a child, you know, that I wasn't very organized and that I didn't think things through. Like my dad, I have a wonderful father, but my dad would always say, pense avec ta tête, pas avec tes pieds, which means think with your head and not with your feet. Now it seems like a really innocent thing to be saying to your child. It's kind of cute, it's kind of silly, it's not a big deal, it's not like abusive or anything. However, he said that enough to me whenever I was making like a silly mistake or decision that you know, it does make a child doubt themselves, and it makes a child just sort of lack confidence, because this is, you know, this is becoming like an identity marker for me, because it's coming from, you know, a person who is like a pillar in my life. This is my dad, right? So because he's someone who has authority, I believe what he thinks of me, and that becomes part of my identity. And so we do this through our lives. What teachers tell us, what doctors tell us, what our parents tell us, what, you know, what the president tells us, these become, we take these things as being truth about us, about our world around us, you know, when it happens when we're young enough, and we absorb that. And when that becomes our focus, this becomes our truth, right? And we actually change our lives so that we're living out that truth, as opposed to being more open-minded about ourselves and about the world around us and trying different things out. So, you know, this is an unfortunate way that important people in our lives stunt us, but it's the repeating of the stories, and it's our own focus that actually does the damage, because that's when we start to, like how Hannah Gadsby, this comedian, the way she put it is that our focus becomes our truth, and the tension around that, because, you know, she uses tension, but we could use stress or anxiety, or, I mean, you can really, maybe obsession, you can really just use your own words here. But our tension around the stories is what feeds the trauma. And that's when you get into a loop that becomes really, really hard to break. So for the past almost year, maybe a little bit less than a year, my husband and I, we've been in therapy. Not because there's anything, like, we have a great relationship. It's not perfect. We've been together for 8 years, so obviously there's, you know, there's all kinds of issues and problems, and like we don't get along, you know, 100% of the time. Obviously, we're normal people. But we started seeing a therapist because, I don't know, I have a very woke husband, you know, who is into therapy and encourages us to do these kinds of things and is really into self-improvement. I'm extremely lucky to be with someone like this. And so the therapist that we see is super amazing. And one of the, and by the way, I recommend therapy for everyone, whatever form, you know, that resonates with you, and for every couple. I so recommend it, especially before you get married or before you have children. I think that that's probably the best time to do it because you have a little bit more time and you can really just get your ducks in a row. But anyway, so we see this therapist, and the one of her therapy styles is, I don't think I got the name quite right, but it's something to do with storytelling, or how you shape your life through the stories that you tell. And specifically, so like the way that we've been using it is we've been examining the stories that we tell about our relationship. And stories that, you know, people ask how we met, or just like stories about the beginning of our relationship. Things that started off so innocently, and especially from my end, it started off so innocently, and it just started off showing how lucky I feel to be with the man that I'm with, and how much I love him, and just that I feel special that I was kind of chosen, you know? It started off just very innocently like that, but because I am very self-deprecating, because I don't have super high self-esteem, and because I do have a more often negative focus on my life, which you may not know from my videos, but if you knew me personally, you would, I mean, it's something I'm working on, but that I can be a pessimistic, pretty dark person, and I suffer from anxiety, and you know, so I do have this lens of more pessimism. And what started happening is that the stories that I was telling became so laser focused, and then with this, you know, my life overarching theme of pessimism and self-deprecation, warped these stories so that when I was feeling very low, I could use these sweet stories about how we met and kind of throw them at him like, you don't actually love me because look at this story. And he's like, whoa, you know, like, first of all, this is a story that you use, that yet you tell, and then twist it, like, honestly, like, twisted through a certain lens. Not that it made it untrue or a lie, but just seen through the lens of my life just made it really not true. Like, it added layers of tension and trauma that wouldn't necessarily be there for someone else. And then you get that there's a very fine line between, you know, if he's saying that's not true, is he gaslighting? You know, it's a difficult world that we live in nowadays, I'm telling you, ladies. But no, I mean, it does take two, right? But whenever we're talking about, you know, stories when it comes to, you know, couplehood. But you know, we do this with so many areas of our life, like little things, like if you've been following me on Instagram, because this is kind of a silly example, but you know, this is a place where we mostly talk about skin and hair and these kinds of things, but how I've always loved curly hair, but I've convinced myself over the years that I just have annoying wavy hair, that I could never have, you know, nice curls, that I could never have nice hair because my hair just sucks. And then I started just a week ago following the curly girl method, and I'm like, hey, you know what? Maybe I should stop this story about like how I'll never have nice waves, that I need to heat style, that, you know, my hair is always just like puffing up and it's never in a nice way, blah, blah, blah. Just stop telling myself that so that I can just see myself through like a fresh lens and see the potential that's there rather than just, you know, I'm saying lens a lot, but just see myself, see my hair, you know, through a lens of this hair just sucks, it's hopeless. You know, and look at these waves. I got lots and lots of big, almost like curls. It's actually not that wavy today compared to how it's been, but you know, and it's like, because I just decided to see, like, it sounds so silly, but like I just decided to see my hair differently. You know, I've been working on trying to see my marriage differently. I'm working on trying to see maybe my business differently, my whole life, you know, myself, how responsible I am with money, for example, or how responsible I am as a mother. I'm trying to let go of traumatic loops that I've gotten myself into because of maybe what one person said, maybe something that I said out loud, and then maybe someone agreed with me and I was like, shit, that's proof, you know, and then just getting caught in a loop, right? And this might have nothing to do with other people. It might just be, and it usually is, just stories that we tell ourselves and that we look for evidence to prove these things, you know? And I guess we all just got to a point, and it was the same with Gadsby, where it was just like, enough, you know? And I mean, she's dealing with much bigger things than I'm dealing with in my life. I mean, in some ways, like, you know, I've definitely got, you know, some pretty serious things going on in my life right now. But she's, I mean, you really need to watch the show. She really goes into some really traumatic events. So if that's a triggering thing for you, then maybe you wouldn't want to watch it, but I feel like her story is extremely powerful. And she's very relatable on so many levels. Like, even if you're not in like the LGBTQ community, like, it's still just like we all feel different, and we all feel like we don't fit in. Many of us feel like we don't belong in normal society in one shape or another, that you know, we repress, or that we try to conceal, or that we shame ourselves about. And yeah, so I feel like her story is really powerful. And what I find interesting is that just with the storytelling is how much I've discovered that this has been part of my life. So I really challenge you to look at yourself and see where your repetitive stories have, you know, held you back. And it could be just the simplest things, like the way you wear your hair, to, you know, your clothes, like how you present yourself to the world, to your career choices, and, you know, your relationships around you. So it is really important, actually, to just re-examine those stories and where you've been caught, and where you could write some new stories. And I don't know if you guys know Esther Perel. She's like, she's a couples therapist, psychologist, who is just taking off right now, and she's amazing. I've been actually reading her work for years, and she said that when it comes to relationships, we need to rewrite those stories often. No, oh no, I'm not remembering the quote now. It's something along the lines of write good stories when it comes to relationships and edit often. So anything that's not serving you anymore, you just edit that out. You just write new stories about who your friends are, about your marriage, about your hair, about your skin, whatever it is, you know? You can rewrite those stories. So I'd love to hear in the comment section below what stories you can rewrite. Bye!